Millionaire marries a poor woman as a joke. What she does next leaves him speechless. The air buzzed with anticipation as guests began filling the massive estate's grand garden, their whispers carrying hints of curiosity and judgment. The millionaire, Edward Sterling, stood at the edge of the terrace, surveying the scene below with a smug grin. The sprawling venue was a testament to his wealth. Cascading floral arrangements adorned every corner, fountains danced in synchronized harmony, and a live orchestra played soft, elegant music in the background. Everything about this wedding screamed opulence, except for one glaring detail. All eyes turned to the bride as she stepped hesitantly down the aisle. Anna Harper was unlike any bride this crowd had ever seen. Her dress, though clean and pressed, was modest and outdated, contrasting sharply with the extravagant designer gowns worn by the guests. Her simple black flats were worn at the edges, a quiet rebellion against the luxury that surrounded her. Yet, what struck everyone most wasn't her attire but the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. She walked slowly, chin up, her gaze fixed ahead, seemingly unbothered by the murmurs of the crowd. "Why her?" whispered one elegantly dressed woman, clutching a jeweled clutch in her manicured hands. "She looks like she walked straight out of a thrift store." Another guest chuckled, leaning into his companion. "Edward's always been eccentric. But marrying a girl like that? It must be a joke." And to Edward, that's exactly what it was. This wasn't love, it wasn't even lust. It was a game, a challenge born out of a drunken night with his equally shallow friends. Marry someone completely opposite of you, they had dared him. Find someone who doesn't belong in your world and show her what it's like to live like royalty. Edward had embraced the dare with relish. He had chosen Anna deliberately. He'd met her by chance in a small diner downtown, where she worked long shifts to support herself and her family. Something about her intrigued him, not in a romantic way, but in the way one might admire a peculiar artifact. She was plain, unpolished, and quiet. She didn't fawn over him like the women in his social circle. In fact, she seemed indifferent to his wealth, which only fueled his curiosity further. But tonight, standing at the altar with her, Edward couldn't suppress his smirk. This was the ultimate spectacle. His friends were watching, amused and bewildered. He imagined the laughter they'd share over drinks later, recounting the absurdity of it all. Anna, for her part, stood beside Edward with an unreadable expression. Her dark eyes flickered toward him briefly, but she quickly looked away. If she knew about the bet, she gave no indication. As the priest spoke, she remained composed, her voice steady as she repeated her vows. There was no love in her tone, but neither was there bitterness. It was as though she were fulfilling a solemn duty, nothing more, nothing less. When the ceremony ended and the applause erupted, Edward led Anna to the reception area with a flourish. Cameras flashed, capturing the odd couple's every move. The guests swarmed around them, offering congratulations that ranged from half-hearted to outright insincere. "Anna," one woman said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "However did you meet Edward? It's such a unique match." Anna smiled politely but didn't answer. She let Edward handle the barrage of questions, his charm and quick wit deflecting any real scrutiny. As the evening wore on, Anna found herself drifting toward the edge of the garden, away from the noise and the prying eyes. She sat quietly on a stone bench, watching the shimmering lights reflected in the pool's still surface. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe. This world wasn't hers, it never would be. But she wasn't here by accident. No, Anna had her reasons for accepting Edward's proposal, though she had kept them closely guarded. Behind her, Edward approached with 2 champagne flutes in hand. "Hiding from your adoring fans?" he teased, offering her a glass. Anna glanced up at him, her expression neutral. "Just needed some air." He sat beside her, his tailored suit flawless even after hours of celebration. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the day settling over them. Then Edward spoke again, his tone light but edged with curiosity. "You're a mystery, Anna. Most women would be giddy in your shoes, yet here you are, brooding by the pool. Aren't you the least bit excited about all this?" He gestured toward the glittering scene behind them. Anna met his gaze, her dark eyes steady. "Excited? I'm not a woman who measures happiness in chandeliers and champagne. Edward tilted his head, genuinely intrigued. Then what do you measure it in? She smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, she rose and walked back toward the reception, leaving Edward to ponder her words. As the weeks passed, their new life together unfolded with little fanfare. Edward, true to form, treated the marriage as a novelty. He showed Anna off at social gatherings, reveling in the curiosity she sparked. Yet, he paid little attention to her beyond these events, assuming she was content to enjoy the luxuries of his wealth. But Anna was anything but idle. She spent her days exploring the mansion, quietly observing its workings. She befriended the staff, learning their names and their struggles. She took note of Edward's business dealings, often overhearing conversations during his loud, boisterous dinner parties. She asked questions, careful, probing questions, without ever revealing too much of herself. Edward, oblivious to her growing understanding of his world, continued to underestimate her. He saw her as a quiet, docile figure, content to fade into the background. Little did he know, Anna was planning something far greater than he could imagine. Edward's friends often dropped by unannounced, filling the grand dining room with laughter that echoed against the high ceilings. They treated Anna like an oddity, a quaint decoration in Edward's otherwise impeccable life. She never reacted, never took the bait when they made sly comments or laughed too loudly at jokes she knew were at her expense. Instead, she listened, observing them as much as they observed her. Anna, dear, one of them, Victoria, drawled one evening over a glass of wine. What did you do before marrying Edward? Surely something fascinating? Anna set her fork down gently, her movements precise and measured. I worked at a diner downtown. The table erupted into thinly veiled laughter, the kind that felt more like a slap than genuine amusement. Edward smirked but said nothing, leaning back in his chair to watch the exchange unfold. A diner, Victoria repeated, her tone dripping with condescension. How quaint. And now you're here, living in all this? She gestured dramatically to the chandelier above them. It must feel like stepping into a fairy tale. Anna smiled faintly. Fairy tales usually have lessons hidden in them, don't they? Victoria's laughter faltered, her expression shifting to one of confusion. Edward's eyes flicked toward Anna, curious but unwilling to break the silence. The room grew quieter, the air tinged with an unspoken tension. You must tell me, Victoria pressed, clearly uncomfortable with being outmaneuvered. What's the lesson in this fairy tale? Anna tilted her head, her smile steady. Perhaps it's too early to say. But every story has a twist, doesn't it? Edward chuckled, breaking the moment. Anna loves her riddles, he said, dismissing the subtle power shift. She's keeping us all on our toes. The conversation moved on, but Edward couldn't shake the look in Anna's eyes. It wasn't defiance, exactly, but something quieter, calculated, deliberate. He brushed the thought away, chalking it up to the novelty of having someone like her in his life. She was different, yes, but harmless. Or so he thought. In truth, Anna was anything but harmless. She had spent weeks acclimating to Edward's world, piecing together the puzzle of his empire and his carefully curated image. She wasn't just observing for the sake of survival, she was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something that Edward could never see coming. One day, while Edward was out meeting clients, Anna wandered into the study. It was a room she had seen only briefly, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books that seemed more decorative than functional. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, papers and ledgers scattered across its surface. She hesitated for a moment, listening for any sound that might indicate someone nearby. The house was quiet. She moved toward the desk, her fingers grazing the edges of the papers. Financial reports, contracts, and correspondence, all of it meticulously organized. Anna wasn't looking for anything specific, she was simply trying to understand. As she read through the documents, patterns began to emerge. Edward's wealth was vast, but it wasn't as stable as it seemed. Some of his ventures were floundering, propped up only by the illusion of success. Anna's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't her place to meddle, or so she told herself. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered otherwise. She had been brought into this world as a joke, a pawn in Edward's game. But she didn't have to stay a pawn. She could rewrite the rules. When Edward returned that evening, Anna was in the kitchen, chatting with the staff as they prepared dinner. She had developed a rapport with them, her genuine interest in their lives earning her quiet admiration. Edward paused in the doorway, watching her laugh softly at something the chef said. For a moment, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar, a mix of curiosity and unease. "You're making quite the impression," he said as she turned to him. Anna's smile didn't falter. "Am I?" He gestured toward the staff. "They adore you. You've managed to charm everyone in this house." Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. "Not everyone, I think." Edward raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being at a loss for words, especially not with her. Shaking off the moment, he took her arm and led her to the dining room. "Come on, let's eat." Over the following weeks, Edward began to notice changes in his household. The staff, who had once been stiff and formal in his presence, seemed livelier. They worked with a quiet efficiency that hadn't been there before, their respect for Anna subtly influencing their attitude toward their work. Even his friends, who had initially dismissed her, started to show hints of grudging respect. Anna had a way of disarming people, her quiet intelligence leaving them unsure how to categorize her. One evening, Edward returned home to find Anna in the study, poring over a stack of papers. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm but alert. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Just reading," she replied, gesturing to the papers. "You've built quite the empire, Edward. It's fascinating." He smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Fascinating isn't the word I'd use." She set the papers down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You have a gift for taking risks. But some of those risks, they're teetering on the edge." Edward's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Anna shrugged, her tone casual. "Just an observation. I could be wrong." For the first time, Edward felt a flicker of doubt. How much did she know? And how had she gleaned it? He didn't press her, unwilling to reveal his own unease. But as he left the study, he couldn't shake the feeling that Anna was more perceptive than he had given her credit for. What Edward didn't realize was that Anna's observations were more than casual. She had been studying his business dealings meticulously, identifying weak points and opportunities alike. She wasn't just learning, she was preparing. For what, even she wasn't entirely sure. But she knew one thing. This wasn't the life Edward had imagined for her, and it wouldn't be the life she allowed herself to settle for. The first real shift came during a dinner party. One of Edward's business associates, a gruff man named Richard, had been discussing a potential investment opportunity, a high-risk venture that Edward seemed eager to pursue. Anna listened quietly as the men spoke, her expression impassive. When there was a lull in the conversation, she spoke. "That venture, isn't it tied to a market that's already oversaturated?" Richard looked at her, startled. "Excuse me?" Anna met his gaze evenly. "The market. It's oversaturated. Entering it now would be a gamble, especially with competitors who already dominate the space." Edward stared at her, his fork frozen midway to his mouth. Richard laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "And how exactly would you know that?" Anna smiled faintly. "I read." The table fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Edward, for once, didn't know what to say. The conversation eventually moved on, but the atmosphere had shifted. Anna's presence was no longer easily dismissed. As the guests left that evening, Edward lingered in the doorway, watching Anna as she tidied up the dining room. "You've been holding out on me," he said, his tone half joking. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Have I?" He stepped closer, studying her. "There's more to you than meets the eye, isn't there?" Anna didn't answer. Instead, she smiled softly and walked past him, leaving Edward to stand alone in the empty room, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his mind. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that Anna was slipping out of the carefully constructed mold he'd envisioned for her. At first, she had been a quiet fixture in his life, someone he could parade around for laughs and novelty. But now, she was becoming something else, something that made him uneasy. Her words lingered, not because they were confrontational, but because they were calculated, precise, and impossible to dismiss. Anna, on the other hand, carried on with her quiet, methodical transformation. She spent her days immersing herself in Edward's world, not out of curiosity but with intent. She had grown accustomed to his staff, his friends, his business dealings, and, most importantly, the cracks in the foundation of his empire. Slowly, she began to weave herself into the fabric of his life, not in the way he had imagined but on her own terms. One afternoon, Edward invited a group of investors to the estate for a meeting. These were powerful men, the kind of people whose decisions shaped industries and economies. Edward thrived in their presence, his charisma and confidence on full display. Anna had no role in the meeting, at least, not according to Edward's plan. She was supposed to remain out of sight, a silent figure in the background. But Anna had other ideas. She entered the room midway through the discussion, her presence commanding attention despite her understated demeanor. The men paused, their conversation faltering as she approached. "Forgive me for interrupting," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about the tech investment." Edward frowned, his irritation thinly veiled. "Anna, this is a private meeting." She ignored him, her gaze fixed on the men at the table. "I just thought it might be worth considering the impact of emerging market trends. It seems to me that the data points to a shift in consumer behavior, one that could make this investment more volatile than it appears." The room fell silent. One of the investors, a gray-haired man with a sharp gaze, leaned forward. "And what data would that be?" Anna met his gaze without hesitation. "The decline in user engagement for similar platforms over the last 6 months, for one. It suggests saturation, and the lack of diversification in their revenue streams only compounds the risk." Edward's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. "Anna, I think you've made your point." But the investor raised a hand, silencing Edward. "She's not wrong," he said, his tone thoughtful. "I've seen similar reports. It's something we should consider." The discussion shifted, the men now debating the risks and merits of the investment with newfound caution. Edward sat in silence, his annoyance simmering beneath the surface. Anna had done what no one else in the room had dared, challenge their assumptions. And she had done it with an ease that left him both impressed and unsettled. After the meeting, Edward confronted her in the hallway. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice low but heated. Anna met his gaze calmly. "That was me trying to help." "I didn't ask for your help," he snapped. "No," she said, her tone unwavering. "But you needed it." For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension between them thick and unyielding. Then, without another word, Anna turned and walked away, leaving Edward to wrestle with the uncomfortable truth she had laid bare. As the weeks passed, Anna's influence grew. She began to take a more active role in Edward's life, not because he invited her to but because she chose to. She attended his meetings, her quiet observations often leading to insights that Edward couldn't ignore. She charmed his investors and associates, her intelligence and composure earning their respect in ways that surprised even her. But it wasn't just Edward's business dealings that Anna began to transform. She also took an interest in the lives of the people around them, the staff, the vendors, the workers who kept Edward's empire running smoothly. She listened to their stories, their struggles, and their frustrations, often finding ways to address their concerns without drawing attention to herself. One day, the estate's head chef, a middle-aged man named Robert, approached her with a troubled expression. "Mrs. Sterling," he began hesitantly, "I don't mean to trouble you, but there's been an issue with the suppliers." Anna tilted her head, her interest piqued. "What kind of issue?" Robert explained the situation, a delay in payments from Edward's accounts that had strained relationships with several long-standing suppliers. Anna frowned, her mind already working to piece together a solution. "Thank you for letting me know, Robert," she said. "I'll take care of it." She approached Edward later that day, her tone measured but firm. "There's a problem with the suppliers. Payments are delayed, and it's causing unnecessary strain." Edward looked up from his laptop, his expression impatient. "That's not your concern, Anna." "It is if it affects the people who work here," she replied. "And it's an easy fix. I reviewed the accounts, and there's enough liquidity to resolve this immediately." Edward stared at her, his irritation giving way to surprise. "You reviewed the accounts?" Anna met his gaze evenly. "Yes. And I noticed a few other discrepancies that might be worth addressing." For the first time, Edward felt a flicker of unease. Anna was no longer the quiet, unassuming figure he had married on a whim. She was becoming something else entirely, someone who challenged him, outmaneuvered him, and forced him to confront truths he would rather ignore. But Edward wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the estate's manicured gardens, Edward turned to her with a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "Why did you marry me, Anna?" he asked, his tone casual but edged with curiosity. Anna took a sip of her wine, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Why did you marry me?" she countered. Edward hesitated, caught off guard by her response. "You know why," he said finally. "It was unconventional. Something different?" She smiled faintly, her eyes still on the horizon. "Exactly." He frowned, her answer leaving him more confused than before. "What does that mean?" Anna turned to him, her expression calm but inscrutable. "It means I married you for the same reason you married me. Because it was unconventional. Because it was different." Edward leaned back in his chair, her words leaving him with more questions than answers. For the first time, he realized that he didn't understand Anna at all. And that realization both intrigued and unsettled him. What Edward didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Anna had her own reasons for marrying him, reasons she had kept carefully hidden. She had entered his world not as a victim of his whim but as a strategist, a woman with a plan that was slowly, meticulously unfolding. Edward found himself thinking about Anna more than he liked to admit. She had become an enigma, a force he couldn't quite predict or control. It unnerved him. She had taken what was meant to be a passing amusement and turned it into something far more complicated. At times, he caught himself watching her from a distance, trying to decipher her thoughts, her motives. But Anna had built walls that he couldn't penetrate, and she seemed perfectly content to leave him guessing. Meanwhile, Anna's influence within Edward's circle continued to grow. She wasn't loud or ostentatious about it. She moved with quiet precision, choosing her moments carefully. At social gatherings, she would engage in conversations that left Edward's friends either deeply impressed or mildly unsettled. Her intelligence, once dismissed as inconsequential, was becoming harder to ignore. It wasn't long before Edward's closest confidants began to notice the shift. One evening, Edward hosted a private dinner with his inner circle, a group of business partners and lifelong friends who had been with him through every twist and turn of his rise to wealth. The dinner was a lavish affair, with every detail meticulously planned, from the floral arrangements to the vintage wines. Edward had spared no expense, as usual. Anna sat at the far end of the table, seemingly out of the spotlight. She spoke little during the early part of the evening, content to let the others dominate the conversation. But when the topic turned to a lucrative overseas investment, her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Have you considered the regulatory risks?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her. One of Edward's partners, a man named Charles, chuckled. "Regulatory risks? That's hardly a concern for us." Anna met his gaze steadily. "It should be. The recent policy changes in that region are likely to impact foreign investors, particularly those entering the market with high capital. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when." Charles blinked, clearly caught off guard. "And how would you know that?" Anna's smile was faint but unwavering. "I read extensively. And I pay attention." Edward watched the exchange with a mixture of irritation and fascination. Charles wasn't the kind of man who took kindly to being challenged, yet here he was, visibly thrown off balance by Anna's quiet confidence. "She has a point," another partner chimed in. "I've heard murmurs about those policy changes as well. It might be worth reevaluating." Charles looked to Edward for support, but Edward said nothing. He couldn't bring himself to undermine Anna, not when she was right. After the dinner, Edward confronted her in the study. His tone was sharp, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity. "What exactly are you trying to do, Anna?" She looked up from the book she had been reading, her expression calm. I'm not trying to do anything, Edward. I'm simply contributing. Contributing? He laughed bitterly. You're making me look like a fool in front of my own friends. Anna set the book aside and stood, facing him with quiet determination. If you feel like a fool, Edward, it's not because of me. It's because you refuse to see what's right in front of you. Her words stung, but Edward couldn't deny their truth. For the first time, he began to see Anna not as an outsider in his world but as someone who had the power to reshape it. Days turned into weeks, and Anna's role in Edward's life continued to evolve. She began accompanying him to his office, where she observed meetings and asked questions that made even the most seasoned executives pause. Her insights were sharp, her ability to cut through the noise uncanny. At first, Edward's team resisted her presence, dismissing her as a meddling wife. But over time, they grew to respect her, even if begrudgingly. One afternoon, Edward's CFO, a man named Gregory, approached him with a concerned expression. "Edward, I need to talk to you about Anna." Edward leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "What about her?" Gregory hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "She's exceptional. Her understanding of the business is, well, it's impressive. She's uncovered inefficiencies we've been overlooking for years." Edward raised an eyebrow. "And that's a problem?" Gregory shook his head. "No, not a problem. But it's unexpected. She's not what any of us thought she was." Edward didn't respond immediately. He knew Gregory was right. Anna was unlike anyone he had ever encountered, and she was changing everything. But the changes weren't limited to Edward's professional life. Anna was also reshaping the household in ways that were impossible to ignore. She had become a confidant to the staff, a mediator in disputes, and a source of quiet strength for those who needed it. Her influence was pervasive, touching every corner of Edward's world. One evening, as Anna walked through the gardens, she found Edward sitting alone on a stone bench. He looked up as she approached, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Do you ever regret this?" he asked, his voice quiet. Anna tilted her head, studying him. "Regret what?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely. "The way it all started." She sat beside him, her posture relaxed. "Do you?" Edward hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I've underestimated you." Anna smiled faintly. "You have?" He laughed softly, the sound tinged with self-awareness. "You don't pull any punches, do you?" "No," she said simply. "I don't." They sat in silence for a while, the night air cool and crisp around them. For the first time, Edward felt something he hadn't expected to feel in Anna's presence, a sense of peace. But peace was fleeting, and Edward's world was about to face its biggest challenge yet. The peace Edward felt that evening didn't last long. Trouble came in the form of a financial scandal, a storm brewing just beneath the surface of his empire. A rival company had obtained sensitive information about his operations and was threatening to expose discrepancies in his dealings. The news came as a shock, rattling Edward's carefully constructed world. "We have to get ahead of this," Gregory said, pacing Edward's office the following morning. "If this leaks, it could destroy everything." Edward sat behind his desk, his hands steepled as he tried to process the implications. "Who's behind it?" Gregory hesitated. "We suspect Carter Holdings. They've been trying to undermine you for years." Edward clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. "And how did they get this information? Who leaked it?" "We don't know," Gregory admitted. "But we need to act fast. Damage control is critical." Anna entered the room quietly, her presence a stark contrast to the tension in the air. She had overheard part of the conversation and could see the strain on Edward's face. "What's going on?" she asked. Edward glanced at her, his instinct to dismiss her fading as he realized he could use her perspective. "There's been a breach. A rival company is threatening to expose us." Anna frowned, her mind already working through the possibilities. "Do you know what they have?" Gregory handed her a file, his expression wary. "This is what we suspect they've obtained." Anna took the file and began flipping through the documents. As she read, her frown deepened. "Some of this is damning," she admitted. "But it's not insurmountable." Gregory raised an eyebrow. "And how would you know that?" Anna looked up, her gaze steady. Because I've dealt with worse? Her confidence unsettled him, but Edward found it oddly reassuring. What do you suggest? He asked. Anna set the file down and leaned forward. You need to control the narrative. Release a statement before they do. Acknowledge the issues but frame them as challenges you're actively addressing. Transparency will undermine their leverage. Gregory looked skeptical. That's risky. It could backfire. Everything about this situation is risky, Anna countered. But staying silent makes you look guilty? Edward nodded slowly, his respect for Anna growing with each word she spoke. She's right, he said. Prepare the statement. As the team scrambled to execute Anna's plan, Edward couldn't help but marvel at how seamlessly she had stepped into the role of strategist. She wasn't just observing anymore, she was leading. And he was letting her. The statement went out the next morning, and the response was swift. The media picked up the story, but instead of framing it as a scandal, they focused on Edward's proactive approach. The rival company's attempts to capitalize on the situation fell flat, their accusations overshadowed by Edward's transparency. The crisis wasn't over, but the worst had been averted. And it was all because of Anna. That evening, Edward found her in the library, her nose buried in a book as usual. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, before stepping inside. You saved me today, he said, his tone uncharacteristically soft. Anna looked up, her expression unreadable. I did what needed to be done. No, Edward said, shaking his head. You did more than that. You've been doing more than that since the day we got married. And I've been too blind to see it. Anna closed the book and set it aside. Why are you telling me this now? Because I think I owe you an apology, he admitted. For how I treated you, for how I underestimated you. You deserve better. Anna studied him for a long moment before speaking. And what do you plan to do about it? Her question hung in the air, a challenge that Edward wasn't sure he could meet. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to try. Over the next few weeks, Edward made an effort to rebuild his relationship with Anna. He included her in more of his decisions, sought her advice, and treated her with the respect she had long deserved. It wasn't an easy process, old habits died hard, but he was determined to change. Anna, for her part, remained cautious. She had seen enough of Edward's world to know that trust was a fragile thing. But she also saw glimpses of the man he could become, and that gave her hope. The turning point came during a charity gala that Edward hosted at the estate. The event was meant to raise funds for underprivileged communities, a cause that Anna had championed from the beginning. She had taken the lead in organizing the event, pouring her heart and soul into every detail. As the night unfolded, it became clear that the gala was a resounding success. Guests mingled, donations poured in, and the atmosphere was electric. But what struck Edward most was the way people gravitated toward Anna. She moved through the crowd with ease, her warmth and intelligence drawing people to her like a beacon. At one point, Edward stood on the terrace, watching her from a distance. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, pride, admiration, maybe even love. For the first time, he realized that Anna wasn't just his wife. She was his equal, his partner, and the best thing that had ever happened to him. When the night finally came to an end, Edward found Anna sitting by the fountain in the garden, her dress shimmering in the moonlight. He approached her slowly, his footsteps soft against the cobblestones. You were incredible tonight, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Anna looked up, her eyes searching his. So were you. He sat beside her, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. Maybe not. But you're trying. And that matters. For the first time in his life, Edward felt truly humbled. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to love someone. Not as a possession, but as a partner. The days after the gala marked a subtle but significant shift in Edward's life. It wasn't just the realization of Anna's value. It was the dawning awareness of what he had taken for granted, not just in her but in the world she had so gracefully stepped into. Edward began to notice the details she had quietly worked to improve. The staff were happier, more relaxed. The business had shed inefficiencies he hadn't even realized existed, and his own reputation, once a brittle facade, had grown unexpectedly resilient. But for all the positive changes, Edward found himself plagued by a nagging doubt. What did Anna want? She had stepped into his world with such quiet confidence, reshaping it in ways he hadn't foreseen. Yet she remained an enigma, her true motives as obscured as they had been on the day they married. It was during a late autumn afternoon, as the estate's sprawling grounds turned gold and amber under the fading sunlight, that Edward decided to confront her. He found her in the garden, pruning roses with the meticulous care that seemed to define everything she did. "Anna," he began, his tone unusually hesitant. She glanced up from her work, her eyes warm but guarded. "Yes?" He hesitated, his hands in his pockets. "I need to ask you something." She set the pruning shears aside and faced him fully, her expression calm. "Go ahead. Why did you marry me?" The words came out sharper than he intended, laced with frustration and curiosity. "I mean, truly. You must have known what I was doing, how superficial it all was. So why did you say yes?" Anna regarded him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then she smiled faintly, a bittersweet curve of her lips. "You think I didn't know?" Edward blinked, taken aback. "You knew." "Of course I knew," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not naive, Edward. I saw through you the moment you walked into that diner." He stared at her, struggling to process her words. "Then why?" Anna's gaze turned distant, her eyes flickering over the roses she had been tending. "Because I saw potential. Not in your wealth or your power, but in you. Beneath all the arrogance and the bravado, I saw someone who could be so much more. If only he realized it." Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Guilt? Gratitude? "And that was enough for you? A gamble on potential?" Anna's smile widened slightly. "Let's just say I've always been good at playing the long game." Her words left Edward reeling. He had spent so much time underestimating her, treating her as a curiosity or a pawn in his game. Yet all along she had been playing her own game, a far more profound and strategic one. The conversation haunted him in the days that followed. Edward found himself replaying her words, trying to reconcile the image of Anna he had constructed with the reality of who she was. She wasn't just the clever, capable woman who had stepped into his world. She was someone who had seen him, truly seen him, even when he hadn't seen himself. Meanwhile, Anna continued to weave her influence through Edward's life, her quiet strength reshaping the very fabric of his existence. She began spearheading initiatives that elevated his business in ways he hadn't imagined. One of her projects, a mentorship program for underprivileged youth, quickly gained traction, earning widespread acclaim and bolstering Edward's reputation as not just a businessman, but a philanthropist. At first, Edward had resisted the idea. "We're not a charity, Anna," he had said, his tone dismissive. "No," she had replied calmly. "But we're people. And people have a responsibility to each other." Her words had stayed with him, and over time, he found himself coming around to her perspective. The mentorship program became a cornerstone of his company's outreach efforts, and Edward found himself genuinely proud of the work they were doing. It was a new feeling for him, pride not in his wealth or achievements, but in the difference he was making. But not everyone in Edward's world was as receptive to Anna's influence. His oldest friend, William, had been openly skeptical of her from the beginning. A sharp-tongued lawyer with a penchant for cynicism, William had never trusted Anna, and her growing role in Edward's life only deepened his suspicions. One evening, as Edward and William shared drinks in the study, the tension between them came to a head. "She's changing you," William said, his tone accusatory. "And not for the better." Edward frowned, swirling his whiskey in his glass. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you've lost your edge," William said. "You're letting her run the show. This mentorship program, the charity work. Do you even recognize yourself anymore?" Edward set his glass down with a sharp clink. "Maybe that's the point, William. Maybe I didn't like the man I was." William scoffed, his expression hard. "And you think she's doing this out of the goodness of her heart?" "Wake up, Edward. She's playing you." Edward's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You're wrong." "Am I?" William leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Think about it. A woman like her, marrying a man like you under those circumstances? She's got an angle, Edward. They always do. The words stung, not because Edward believed them, but because they echoed the doubts that had lingered in the back of his mind. He pushed them aside, refusing to let William's cynicism poison what he had built with Anna. But the conversation left him unsettled, and that night as he lay awake beside Anna, he found himself wondering, did William have a point? Or was he simply unable to see what Edward now understood, that Anna's influence had made him better, not weaker? The answer came a few days later, during a meeting with one of Edward's most influential investors. The man, a no-nonsense tycoon named Harris, had been a staunch supporter of Edward's for years. But he was also known for his ruthlessness, and he had never been shy about voicing his opinions. "I have to say," Harris began, his tone gruff, "this mentorship program of yours was a surprise. I didn't peg you for the charitable type." Edward braced himself, unsure whether Harris's words were a compliment or a criticism. "It's been a learning experience," he said carefully. Harris chuckled, his sharp eyes glinting with amusement. "I'll bet it has. But here's the thing, you're making waves. Good ones. People are noticing, and it's changing how they see you. How they see us." Edward blinked, taken aback. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all," Harris said. "It's a damn asset. This program of yours, it's not just good PR. It's good business. And it's all because of her." He nodded toward Anna, who was seated at the far end of the table, quietly taking notes. Edward followed Harris's gaze, his chest tightening as he watched Anna. She looked up briefly, meeting his eyes with a small, knowing smile. It was in that moment that Edward realized the truth. Anna wasn't playing him. She was elevating him. And he owed her more than he could ever express. Edward had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to anticipate their moves before they made them. But Anna had shattered that confidence. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a force he couldn't predict. And yet, for all his uncertainty, one thing was becoming clear: he no longer wanted to solve her. He wanted to stand beside her, to be the man she had seen buried beneath his arrogance. But as Edward's admiration for Anna grew, so did the pressures around them. William's doubts, though dismissed outwardly, lingered in Edward's mind like a shadow. The whispers of skepticism from his peers, the undercurrent of tension among his closest allies, everything felt precarious, as though one wrong move could unravel the fragile balance they had built. One evening, as Edward and Anna sat in the study, he decided to voice his thoughts. "Do you trust me?" he asked abruptly, the words startling even himself. Anna looked up from the papers she had been reading, her expression thoughtful. "Why do you ask?" "Because I feel like I'm constantly trying to prove myself to you," he admitted. "And I don't know if I've done enough." Anna's gaze softened, and for the first time, Edward saw a hint of vulnerability in her. "Trust isn't something you prove, Edward. It's something you build." "And have I?" he pressed. "Have I built it with you?" She set the papers aside and leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You've come a long way. But trust isn't about a destination, it's about the journey. And our journey is still unfolding." Her words were both reassuring and challenging, a reminder that their relationship was still a work in progress. Edward nodded, resolved to continue proving himself, not just to her, but to the man he wanted to become. The following weeks tested that resolve. A new opportunity arose, a major acquisition that could solidify Edward's empire but carried significant risk. His team was divided on whether to proceed, and Edward found himself torn between the cautious voices of his advisors and his own ambition. Anna, as always, offered a fresh perspective. She sat with him late into the night, analyzing the deal from every angle, her insights sharp and unrelenting. "You can do this," she said finally, her tone steady. "But only if you're willing to approach it differently. This isn't about power or control, it's about vision. What do you want this acquisition to represent?" Her words struck a chord, forcing Edward to confront his own motives. For years, his decisions had been driven by ego, by the need to assert his dominance in the business world. But now, he saw an opportunity to build something lasting, something meaningful. When the deal was finalized, it was hailed as a masterstroke, a bold but thoughtful move that redefined Edward's legacy. And once again, it was Anna who had guided him toward the path of success. The ripple effects of the acquisition were immediate. Edward's reputation soared, his newfound humility and foresight earning him praise from even his harshest critics. But more importantly, the acquisition created opportunities for the mentorship program to expand, impacting countless lives in the process. At the heart of it all was Anna, whose quiet brilliance had become the cornerstone of Edward's empire. Yet, for all her success, she remained grounded, her focus always on the greater good. One evening, as they walked through the gardens, Edward turned to her with a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Are you happy?" he asked, his tone earnest. Anna glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Happiness is complicated," she said. "But I'm content. And that's enough." Edward nodded, though her answer left him wanting. He wanted more than her contentment. He wanted her joy, her fulfillment. And he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he wanted to be the one to give it to her. But happiness, as Anna had said, was complicated. And their journey was far from over. The final test came in the form of a betrayal, one that cut deeply and threatened to undo everything they had built. A member of Edward's inner circle, emboldened by greed and jealousy, leaked sensitive information to the press, sparking a media frenzy. The betrayal was a stark reminder of the fragility of trust, and it sent shockwaves through Edward's world. Anna was the first to recognize the threat, her instincts sharper than ever. She worked tirelessly to mitigate the damage, her calm demeanor masking the storm within. "We'll get through this," she told Edward one night, her hand resting on his. "But we need to be honest, with each other and with the world." Edward nodded, his gratitude for her unwavering support palpable. Together, they crafted a plan, one that emphasized transparency and accountability. It was a risky move, but it was the only way forward. When Edward addressed the media, he spoke not as a businessman but as a leader. He acknowledged the mistakes that had been made, took responsibility for the missteps, and outlined a plan to rebuild trust. His candor was disarming, his sincerity impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, Anna worked to identify the source of the betrayal, her determination unyielding. When the culprit was finally exposed, Edward was both heartbroken and furious. It was William. Confronting his oldest friend was one of the hardest things Edward had ever done. William, for all his faults, had been a constant in his life, a reminder of where he had come from and how far he had risen. But betrayal had no place in the new world Edward was building, and he knew he couldn't let it go unaddressed. "Why?" Edward demanded, his voice trembling with anger. William looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what you were becoming. Afraid of her." "Anna?" Edward asked, his disbelief evident. "You did this because of her?" William nodded, his expression pained. "She's changed you, Edward. And I didn't know how to handle it." Edward stared at him, his anger giving way to sadness. "She changed me for the better, William. And if you can't see that, then you don't know me at all." The fallout was swift and irreversible. William was removed from Edward's inner circle, his betrayal a painful but necessary lesson in the cost of trust. But through it all, Anna remained a constant, her strength and wisdom guiding Edward through the storm. When the dust finally settled, Edward and Anna stood together on the terrace, looking out over the estate. The sun was setting, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson. "We made it," Edward said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Anna smiled, her hand slipping into his. "We did." In that moment, Edward realized that their journey had been more than a test of resilience. It had been a transformation. And for the first time, he felt truly at peace, not because of his wealth or his power, but because of the woman beside him.